let's start with date rape.
Start with date rape.
Yeah, I knew that was coming.
So for your gains, actually, GHB is like the superior version of alcohol. It's like it does a lot of things the alcohol does without the calories. So quite unfortunate that people have to go around raping people because of this. It messes up our gains. But
I think that needs to be the quote of the podcast.
You're listening to the Propane Fitness Podcast, your ultimate resource for fat loss and muscle gain, with none of the gimmicks. With your hosts, Yusuf and Johnny. Simple rules, dramatic results.
Welcome to the Propane Fitness Podcast. We are here with Menno Henselmans today from Bayesian Bodybuilding. I'm really excited about this particular episode. I've been following Menno for a while. He's originally a statistician and economist, and really just he's one of the true evidence-based guys in the fitness industry, and he really just leaves no stone unturned, challenging some of the big rock assumptions that we often take for granted, and often comes out with some pretty unexpected results as well. So hello Menno. How are you
guys
doing? So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know that you have a background in sort of data analysis and economics.
Right. Yeah, my education wasn't in nutrition or exercise science or anything like that. I had a pretty unconventional career path. That's sector. I was a business consultant, specialized in advanced statistical data analysis. So there I actually employed statistics and economics to do corporate work, but it wasn't really what I found 100% fulfilling in life. So considering fitness has always been my passion, I gradually worked up to being able to start working for myself and that worked out well. So now we're just talking about this. Bayesian Bodybuilding is now an 8-person company, and coaching doing great. We have the PT course, so it's actually expanding as a really popular certification program now, where we promote evidence-based fitness and the Bayesian method. So things are great.
That's really cool. So as a statistician then, would you rather flip a coin and receive $10 billion instantly, or if you get a heads, and then if you get a tails, you die instantly?
Rationally speaking, it would be good to flip the coin, because instant death is basically neutral.
Yep.
Right, so it has a huge payoff and no downside that you'll be alive to witness.
So it's a win-win.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a win-win, but
I think that's a very unique way of looking at it, but I can't argue with you. So good perspective. So you're completely neutral to instant death. Not bothered at all.
Well, you have to be.
You have no choice, have you? It's true. How do you find... so, Menno, we both also have a background in economics, and less so stats and maths. Or what did you do? You did some maths,
Maths and business, yeah.
Yeah, so we both have a similar background. How do you find that supports, helps, contradicts your current job, which is obviously online coaching and running various online products?
I feel that it has really shaped how I look at things. I don't really apply anything concrete that I learned. I mean, the mathematical models and statistics that I learned are way beyond anything I really apply in practice. You see, shards of it in the scientific studies that we analyze. There were somewhat complicated statistical analysis for a few studies that we have coming up, and for the Metabolic Damage paper that we had. But it's mainly the way of thinking that you learn, and I was really happy to have really, really good actual scientists as my professors at college. So they really ingrained a scientific mindset for us, not just, these are the textbooks, this is what you should learn. They really made us question everything. They taught us to think for ourselves, challenge the assumptions of literature. So I feel that really helped me distinguish myself, because as you say, I generally aim for the top in everything I do, and I only publish things if I feel that My articles should be something that either advances the industry, challenges some assumption, makes people think about something, or like the latest articles about cholesterol and anti-nutrients, things that maybe people aren't taking into account that may actually be relevant. Those kind of things, So there are many articles that I could write about stuff that's more known or other people have already written about, but I don't publish those kind of things. You could say, some people say they're compilers and innovators, and I definitely try to be an innovator in that regard, even though it means less frequent content.
Well, I think it is great that you do choose to tackle these things, because a lot of your main content has been stuff that is kind of taken for granted in the fitness industry, and every time someone comes along and challenges it often, I'm sure you've been met with a lot of resistance for a lot of the stuff that you've come out with. Martin Burkhan, great example as well of overthrowing the meal frequency idea a few years ago, and now the cascade of effects that's had on the industry is pretty huge. So yeah, really good to see. So something you mentioned, Menno, on one of your podcasts maybe a few weeks ago was about not living with regrets. And this was something that really resonated with myself and Johnny as well, just because I think we were both, and yourself, working in an industry that we weren't enjoying and could definitely see the trajectory, and think in 10 years' time would be very unfulfilled and on the brink of suicide if we didn't do something about it. So, what was your experience working in kind of office jobs and the switch to what you're doing now?
It maybe was not that dramatic, but it was definitely not as fulfilling as what I'm doing now. I can honestly say that my life now I cannot think of how I would like to change it. I'm really, everything that I want to do in life I'm doing. So that's a pretty stark contrast in that sense to what I was doing as a business consultant. And like you say, one of the things that pushed me to start for myself was thinking of how I would perceive my life if I were on my deathbed. And then I would definitely, I know that if I continued on that career path and just, advanced the corporate ladder and did that for 40 years, then I would not be lying on my deathbed thinking, yep, I maximized everything I could in life and this was it. So there's actually a theory, an economic theory called regret theory, which is created by one of my professors at Warwick. And it actually specifies that the most rational way to live, it's a form of bounded rationality. It says that you should arrange your life so that you minimize total lifetime regret. So I'm not sure if I agree with that, but it really illustrates the importance of regret in leading a fulfilling life.
So by that token, then, flipping the coin is always the thing to do, because it's not possible to regret instant death.
Exactly.
Although that's an assumption, isn't it?
That's true.
But
yeah.
Let's not get into that.
Is there life after death?
So I suppose that leaving the corporate world and doing what you're doing now is the same. It's the same theme that we're seeing in your writing, which is challenging an assumption. I assume it's quite rare, at least in my social circle, to be doing what we're doing. Well, I don't know anybody in my social circle. You're like one of the only people we know doing. No, I'm joking. But yeah, it's an uncommon thing. So you're challenging an assumption and doing something different, and obviously we can see that in a lot of your writing. And I think probably when I really started paying attention and became aware of you was your articles and discussion of protein intake and how you're on the lower side of protein intake, which flies directly in the face of some of the stuff that was coming out around the same time with Eric Helms saying, maybe for a dieting bodybuilder it's super high or up to 3 or 2.8 grams per kilo, I think. So do you want to chat a little bit about your justifications for that, your work around that, and why you suggest what you suggest?
Right, so my protein article was one of the first articles that I really implemented my method for, and it caused a huge upset in the industry. I basically tried to forget everything I thought I knew about protein, and I just delved into the literature and tried with a complete blank state of mind because I was actually a proponent of much higher protein intakes before I did this, and I dove into the literature and just went by the data. And then if you do this, it's actually abundantly clear that study after study after study, you're literally talking over 20 studies in using various methods, have repeatedly failed to find any benefit between groups above 1.6 gram per kilogram protein. So if you then add an error margin, as Lemon did, which was in the 90s, you get 1.8 gram per kilogram, and that's generally my default protein intake. I modify it a bit based on a few factors, but in general, most individuals, if they just use that as a minimum, then they're golden for the most part. So if you look at this literature in studies that control for nutrient timing and that actually have some validity, actually even the ones that don't have validity find the same thing. So it's really clear, but it's it was very unconventional.
So why do you think that the...
It's not the data. Yeah.
Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, the thing here is it's not the data. It's the main thing here is just the unconventionality. Like but how can you then say B, even although all the data also says B?
I think we're losing connection
still here?
again.
I got.
We are, but the connection's hit and miss. Is the connection okay for you?
Yeah, it's even though Skype sometimes says losing connection, I can still see and hear you.
Okay, cool. So why do you think the higher protein recommendations have sort of managed to slip through the net?
Mm-hmm. I think the two main reasons are the more is better idea. You know, there are so many studies that show the benefits of high protein intakes that it's hard not to think that, you know, I mean, if protein's so good, then maybe that little extra it adds a bit more. And the second thing is there is a huge, or was, evidence-based fitness has turned this around a bit, but there was a huge influence of the supplement industry. You know, if you look at the big platforms, T-Nation, bodybuilding.com, they're not as big anymore, but it used to be really, really the dominating factors in the industry. Mm-hmm. You know, they are, as companies, supplement companies, you know, so even if not intentionally, then there is definitely, you know, a subconscious bias for these outlets in what they publish and what they recommend. So if you then add magazines which rely on advertisements, and you know, what else is there to sell in our industry than supplements? You know, you can sell someone a pair of gloves, that kind of stuff, but you know, it doesn't really get you any far. Not compared to offering people the magic pill, right? So if you combine these factors, it's easy to see why the protein intake recommendations sort of kept crapping up. And if you then add the fact that it's probably actually true for all the bodybuilders that promote these things, because they are sponsored by supplement companies on the one hand, but also because they are juiced up on several grams of androgenic anabolic steroids, and then you know, you might have some use for that protein intake of 3 grams per kilo.
Right, makes sense.
But for us mortals, probably not.
I suppose, you know, if they can't promote, or they can't sell carbs and fat because companies like Cadbury, you know, are far more efficient at doing that. So, you know. Yeah,
well, they did. They sold carbs. I mean,
Vitargo,
all that shit. Yeah, they did really well. They sold a lot of people sugar for the price of steak.
Special type of sugar, though. That interacts in a certain way with a special type of protein, I suppose. So, yeah. But,
it's like, if you call it sugar, then it's a problem that it's fast absorbing. But if you call it Vitargo, then it's a bonus.
As long as it's cyclic, or so, you know, there's some kind of complicated phrasing in the name, then sugar's fine.
Super Mexical dipeptide hydro.
That's it. Yeah. So on that note as well, I think one of the big shifts as well in the last few years has been the general movement towards the if it fits your macros style eating, and just trying to hit those 3 numbers rather than focusing so much on food quality and micronutrition. What are your thoughts on that? I realise this could be a bit of a Pandora's box.
Yeah, I think that the industry has, like in many cases, it's swung a bit too far in the opposite direction. I mean, when I started bodybuilding, we were still knee-deep in 6 meals a day, Tupperware, rice, broccoli, you know, no exceptions. super high protein intakes, nutrient timing around your workouts. And then because a few of these myths have started to crumble and evidence-based fitness was showing, these things aren't needed, I feel that a lot of people have swung in the complete other direction and thought, none of it matters. So in terms of meal frequency, for example, probably there's a good chance that it doesn't really matter that much within the frame of at least 3 to 5 meals. Often, depending on your distribution across the day, it doesn't matter. Not for energy expenditure, not for protein balance. So, for most relevant outcomes, it doesn't. But there's really not that much literature on this. And for workout nutrition, we know that this anabolic window is actually not this anabolic peep hole, of 1 hour before and after the workout, but it's actually the whole process of muscle growth that occurs afterwards. So, there's a lot of sense to it, if it fits your macros. But the idea that nutrient timing doesn't matter at all, that circadian rhythm factors, they don't have any influence, that when you work out doesn't matter, and especially the recent articles that I mentioned, like cholesterol, anti-nutrients, that's more small stuff. But just dismissing nutrient timing as a whole, those kind of things, they don't make sense. And this idea of the hierarchy, for example, like energy balance, that's the number one thing, and only then do your macros, and then micros, or whatever the hierarchy is. You cannot frame it like that, because if you, for example, put energy balance above your macros, then you're saying, okay, your macros don't matter. Energy balance is first and foremost what you want to, optimize, and only then do your macros matter. But really, if someone's in even a terrible deficit with a sufficient protein intake, then they're probably going to get better results than someone that is barely eating any protein on, say, a vegan diet and has, found the sweet spot for energy balance. So all of these factors interact, and you're talking about margins and, many conditional scenarios. So I feel that a lot of people have gone a bit too far in the nihilist direction, as I call it, like nothing matters.
So that's really interesting, and I suppose in many fields you see this vacillating between extreme ideas until things kind of calibrate and settle. So it's interesting as well, you say that the pyramid, to see it as kind of discrete blocks where there's no interaction, is maybe oversimplified, and that there is some overlap between them. And you mentioned those 2 articles as well, the cholesterol and the anti-nutrients stuff in gluten and dairy as well, I think, was it? So would you be able to discuss a little bit about the pros and cons, really, of these 2?
Right. So the gist of the articles is that for the cholesterol one, it seems that cholesterol is beneficial for muscle growth. So the research we have it's pretty limited. Most of it's coming from the same lab, but it's all pointing in the same direction. We have literature longitudinally, cross-sectionally, and in terms of protein synthesis. So also good theories in terms of what cholesterol can do. It's the building block for anabolic hormones. There are some more complicated things, like it enhances cell membrane strength, which it can also do in your muscle cells, which make them more resistant to muscle damage. Raft formation, which enhances anabolic signaling. These kind of things, more hardcore biochemistry kind of pathways. We know that they're there. So we have the theory and we have the data, which means that probably a lot of people, especially when they're taking the advice from the government, to basically limit cholesterol intake at all costs, they may be missing out on some gains. And that's something that not many people have thought about, because cholesterol, most people cholesterol's bad. End of story. That's the story of cholesterol, basically. It's bad.
So it was that systematic review that you linked to as well that can't find a link between dietary cholesterol intake and cardiovascular disease that is pretty mind-blowing. So
right. Yeah, so it's largely a myth for most individuals, or at least widely overblown, that cholesterol is a major risk factor, because the whole theory of, cholesterol comes in and it clogs your arteries. It doesn't work like that, because your body autoregulates its cholesterol production, because cholesterol is really important. So if you're not consuming any cholesterol, your body will make its own. Now, it doesn't make as much as you would if you don't consume any cholesterol, for example, there's actually a slight difference. It cannot fully compensate, which is probably why it's good to get some from your diet. But the difference in your cholesterol levels for the majority of individuals, regardless of how much cholesterol you eat, your blood levels are really quite stable. So that's where the whole theory falls short in the first place, that it comes in and clogs your arteries. No, it's actually quite a constant level that's in your blood. And even if it does, it improves HDL and LDL cholesterol, which kind of the light version of that story, which is really complicated with adipoproteins and stuff, is that HDL is the good cholesterol, LDL is bad, and LDL basically clogs the arteries, makes will clog your arteries, and HDL cleans them up. So if they increase in the same ratio, your cardiovascular risk is the same, according to most studies. And that basically means that even the hyper responders, which have like genetic abnormalities that makes them actually increase their blood cholesterol level when they eat a lot of eggs, for example, even then there doesn't seem to be increased cardiovascular risk. So heart problems, that kind of stuff, we don't really see that.
So you dispelled some of the negative myths around cholesterol, and some of this was quite new to me as well. What's the argument for eating more cholesterol in your diet if you're a bodybuilder?
Right, that it can improve muscle growth via these mechanisms that we talked about. So there's a good case to be made for having at least about 400 milligrams of cholesterol, and research suggests that it's upward of 800. We don't really have any data on more than that, but it might actually be beneficial, and it doesn't seem to be a risk. Certainly not if you're our kind of population, lean, strength training, healthy eating, whole food based diet individual. Then I think it makes sense to purposefully make sure that you have a decent cholesterol intake in your diet.
So people are probably listening to this, Menno, and thinking, like, I thought I understood all this stuff, and now my world just being shaken up again. And Menno's saying that protein's not as important as we think, and cholesterol we thought was bad, but actually it's bad to not have cholesterol. So I suppose maybe one of the clearest ways to synthesize this so that people don't just panic and turn off the podcast and never listen to us again might be, do you want to discuss how you synthesize what you've learned into your own diet practices? Like, maybe what does a day of eating look like for you? What are the things that you particularly focus on using this evidence in your own practices, in your own diet?
Right. In terms of protein, I make sure to get like 1.8 gram per kilogram, and I don't really worry about going over it or under it. Like, I generally have, when dieting gets really strict, in contest prep, for example, I sometimes cap protein requirements just to make sure that, or cap protein intake just to make sure fat and carbohydrate intake don't go too low, because that's the main risk associated with it. So then you have like a plus 50% error margin. So then actually, a lot of people say that the difference between my approach and Eric Helm's approach, they are huge. But I'm saying 1.8 is the minimum, and I might cap it at 50% over, which is about 2.7, which is basically what Eric Helms is saying, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
He will say you should probably shoot for the 2.7, but it's also quite fine if you drop to the 1.8. And I'm saying you want to hit the 1.8, and it's fine if you go up to 2.7. So the difference aren't really that big in practice.
I think this is the kind of thing with internet drama. People like to really draw out the differences between things, but ultimately it's lifting weights, it's eating some protein. Like,
everyone's like, ooh, Menno's Eric's going to be so upset. Do you, with the 1.8, Menno, do you account for the fact that, so if I said to you, right, I'm going to eat 1.8 grams per kilo, so I was just working that out, for me that's around 160 grams of protein. If I got all of that from, say, cauliflower and broccoli, and just sat there by attrition, just eventually accumulated that, are you kind of, do you control for that? Do you control for the fact that I might be a moron, or I might be like deliberately trying to fly in the face of your recommendations? Is there like a 1.8 grams per kilo coming from lean protein sources, eggs, fish, etc.?
Yeah, you do want to take it into account. Protein quality matters. It definitely does. That's also one of those things that, sort of, if it fits your macros, has probably gone a bit too far in the other direction. But it's mainly vegetarians and vegans where this really, really matters. So what I generally tell my clients is you want to shoot for the 1.8 gram per kilogram as a minimum, and you want to make sure that each meal contains a food source with a complete amino acid profile. And generally then, I just look at their meal plans. I don't give any further restrictions. And I just look at their meal plans and see if they're somewhat reasonable. And almost always it is. So you don't have to worry too much about protein quality, how do you combine the amino acids, complementary sources, that kind of thing. If you just make sure that you have one high quality protein source each meal, then, the dairy, poultry, meat, fish, eggs, those are the big ones, then you're generally good. And it's these kind of extreme scenarios, that's where I like to be a lot more ad hoc. So I look at their meal plans, and I don't want to give them too many rules, because if you start saying people, this is the leucine threshold, you want to consume this much leucine each meal, then people are going to obsess over it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. So do you think, how much of the contribution do you think with, so this association with meat eating and high protein quality versus the kind of the lower, so vegetarians and vegans having worse outcomes with muscle gain and strength, mm-hmm. Do you think it's related to the protein quality itself, or do you think it's a contribution from the cholesterol that you mentioned as well?
Yeah, I'd say both factors definitely matter. Vegans can probably compensate, and I'd say that a vegan diet can be optimal, but you have to put more work in for it. So you have to consider protein quality more, especially full vegans, not lacto-ovo vegetarians. I have quite a few vegan and lacto-ovo clients. You need to be a bit more careful then in terms of protein quality. For a vegan, you actually want to look at complementary sources more. Look at what kind of protein powder they're using. Probably use a blend, like rice and pea protein, for example, is a pretty good blend if you look at the amino acids. And you may want to increase protein intakes a bit. I generally do when diet quality isn't the best. You also probably want to have more saturated fat in the diet, because saturated fat serves as a building block for cholesterol and anabolic hormone production. And cholesterol from plants is really, really slim in terms of content and quality, absorption, bioavailability. So you want to be a lot more precise then with these factors.
That makes sense. So I guess the more artificial restrictions that someone is placing on their diet, such as veganism, or the more tweaking is required to make sure that you're still hitting those targets from stuff that would have been included in a kind of a general inclusive diet in the first place.
Exactly. The more you restrain food choices, also for say a ketogenic diet, then magnesium supplementation is more often needed. So that's another example where if you restrict a lot of food choices, then you have to be more careful with hitting the full spectrum of everything that your body needs.
You got to compensate.
So,
go ahead.
So I just want to get back to the what would Menno do kind of scenario, just to help people synthesize this stuff. So you focus on a protein intake of at least 1.8, but it has a threshold of up to 1.5 times that amount. Some focus on cholesterol every day. Some focus on getting a whole protein source in each meal, 3 to 5 meals per day. And then anything else, like vegetables, fruit, avoiding gluten, avoiding sugar.
Right. In terms of food choices, it really varies depending on my location. I'm a digital nomad, so sometimes when I'm in India or in like next week I'll be in India, and the week after that I'll be in Taiwan, and currently I'm in Thailand. So
wow.
That makes things a bit difficult. But generally I eat lots of veggies. I used to eat a lot of meat, but now it's more fish. I eat lots of fish, lots of veggies. I like fruit a lot because it's so convenient. But it really varies where I am, like what kind of food is available. Because certain fruits, like in tropical areas, you only have the highly caloric kind of fruits. That's trickier to fit in your diet. When I'm in Mexico, for example, and avocados are really cheap and really good, then I might eat more of those. I'll be more likely to implement a ketogenic diet for myself, for example. So I really look at kind of local food choices, but it's always whole food based. It's pretty close to paleo, although I use tons and tons of sweetener and lots of dairy because I'm fully dairy tolerant as a Northwestern European, most are. So with those exceptions, it's kind of paleo-ish. Hardcore paleo people wouldn't say so, but
well, I've got issues with hardcore paleo people anyway, because ultimately, if you're going to a supermarket and buying lettuce from a plastic container, then
you're driving home in your car and living in your house. Yeah.
If you want to be truly paleo, you just need a club and live in the jungle somewhere, and you're not allowed to lift weights.
For the best.
Yeah. I think there's a principle behind it that's good as a framework, but if you take it literally, then things get bad.
I think that's the case with most dietary advice, to be honest. Like, even just generally what you're discussing is that, a lot of this stuff requires just sensible questioning some of the advice, being sensible, implementing it consistently, rather than saying like USN have just brought out a new protein powder that claims to blah blah blah. That's it, right? All of my budget's going on that protein powder. So, but I think everyone's been, I don't know about you, but we've both been guilty of that kind of thought pattern in the past, which I suppose leads you down the path of like, that didn't work. I wonder why. And then as soon as you ask that question, you find yourself on this snowballing journey. And
for sure. I mean,
I suppose
for me, before I set up coaching and started writing articles, before that were years and years of failure. So, a lot of people have this idea that I was doing everything optimal right from the beginning, but I have changed my views on a lot of things. It's just that I got into writing articles and stuff quite late and set up my PT course and stuff pretty early on in my career. So most of my ideas and research I've read were pretty formalized by then compared to many other people that just start writing and then grow. But it's really, I had all those failures that just weren't public.
So if you were to have a chat with little Menno from 5 years ago, what would you tell him? Like, what do you wish you knew as a beginner?
Mini Menno.
Mini Menno.
Mini Man. Oh. All right. So a few things I really messed up. Being way too aggressive with cutting. Basically, I didn't really dream or bulk, but I was definitely too aggressive. So I put on a lot of fat when bulking, and then I crash dieted to 10% body fat or so, and I lost a lot of muscle mass. And if I then looked at my pictures, from one year to the other, due to that and several other factors, there wasn't really any difference by the time summer came around. And I was like, yeah, but you sort of just suppress it and you continue doing what you're doing, and next year the picture looks the same again. So it takes a bit of self-awareness before at some point you realize, okay, I'm now not doing things right, and I'm not making the progress that I want from what I put in.
There's always a delay, isn't there, as well, when you make the repeated mistake and you don't want to admit to yourself, and then eventually you're like, it's overwhelming evidence now that I'm doing something wrong.
I cannot ignore this, that I look exactly the same 3 years in a row.
Yeah, there's a lot of psychological research that supports this. There's like a threshold that you need to cross because your body's really good at minimizing what's called cognitive dissonance. So when new data or a new information comes to play and it conflicts with a certain behavior or information that you already had, then you might think, the scientific answer is like you update, or the Bayesian answer is you update the information you had. But that's not how the brain works. The brain tries to find the easiest way to reconcile these two things, which can be either simply not believing the new information, just flat out ignoring it, or it can be changing in your mind what you were doing before. Or, for example, you really see this with supplements. People that bought a certain supplement, they thought it worked, they invested money in it, and they're now taking it. So there's a certain kind of investment that went into it that they're now taking it. When they hear of new evidence that a certain supplement doesn't work, they get angry, right? Not just like, oh damn. It's like, okay, they take it really personally, and that's cognitive dissonance at play.
We see I suppose the flip side of the equation as well is that when movements emerge within the fitness industry, so fasting was a really good example of this. People who subscribe to that idea, then almost look for ideas and concepts and articles that confirm the fact that fasting is the best thing to be doing, and we get the bias on the other side of the equation as well, so that it's the same, when you're like, I should be cutting and then bulking and then what I'm doing is right. You read articles that confirm that belief, and you're ever more entrenched in this way of thinking until you cross the pissed off threshold and you change what you're doing.
That's exactly what happens, and it's especially in forums, because forums are for this sort of self-confirmation, because there's a certain kind of knowledge that goes around in the forum, and it's not evidence-based. People write a comment, post a reply, there are a few stickies, but most people, they don't back up their data with scientific references and that kind of stuff. So it's mostly just he says, she says, and that just follows like an equilibrium kind of behavior where certain ideas emerge as the truth, and it's really hard to then upset those. There's actually a thread on bodybuilding.com that is like my main beef with If It Fits Your Macros. Someone came on. I probably have the link somewhere. Someone came on, just asked like, okay, so this If It Fits Your Macros, like, what's the scientific evidence for this? That, for example, none of these other factors that they matter. And it was just 3 pages of flaming and literally like calling that person names and like, what are you, like a retard? And
wow,
really, really bad. So just the idea of someone challenging these notions, when these beliefs have been firmly established in a certain community, it really upsets people. And that's how you stay, you don't advance intellectually.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much ego can get in the way of that, especially with the internet, as you said, with the anonymous keyboard warrior can just flame. And I think there's a lot of individuals in the fitness industry that kind of typecast themselves, and they invest their identity in a specific idea. So you have like the low carb guy or the fasting guy or the low, and the resistance to updating their own views and taking the ego hit and saying, you know what, I was wrong about that, but we're constantly exploring and growing as the data shapes our understanding of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the first mistake was crash dieting too aggressively. Was there anything else that you would look back on to Mini Menno?
Right. One thing that also, I wasted so much time on stretching. Like, just like 15 minutes of dynamic stretching beforehand, 15 minutes of static stretching post-workout. Like, if I just put that time into working out more frequently, I'd have made a lot better results as well. I'm not sure if it actually decreased my gains, but it might have. There's actually some evidence that excessive stretching, for example, can impair IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1 production. So there's like some mechanisms by which it can actually be harmful. And but mainly just a waste of time, I think. And it never did anything for my squat. And my squat now is better than it's ever been. It's really solid in terms of technique, consistent, no problem hitting parallel or going lower. Did all the stretching in the world, never did squat for my squat. So another thing, I fell prey to the whole functional training, low volume kind of vibe. And that really, as I became more advanced, it came at the worst possible time. So I was like getting into the intermediate advanced levels, and then my ideas were changed that I needed less volume and I needed to take it really easily and spend more time like building functional and not being a bodybuilder, focusing just on the main compound lifts, that kind of stuff. And I was just too advanced for that already, because I had the basics in place. I was pretty strong on all the compounds lifts, and that was just not what I needed to make the advanced level. So I spent probably at least 2-3 years just not making any solid progress, getting a bit of strength, but not really any size. I think those were my biggest mistakes.
Just to pick up on one of the points you made there, Menno, about stretching. So Yusuf sent me a video the other day of you barbell squatting, I believe. Is that right?
High bar squats.
High bar, yeah. And you are, how tall are you?
Connection.
Oh,
did you hear
me?
Oh.
The connection's bad?
Yeah, it's fixed.
I can still hear you guys.
That's back up to normal now.
Yeah, back. All right.
Cool.
Okay, so 6'1", which is 1 meter 85 centimeters.
So that's it. That's exactly the same as me. And I have, well, whenever I post a video of me squatting on Instagram, the comments I get are always centered around leg length, height, and it for me, squatting especially, I think feels like I'm traveling like a mile down towards the center of the earth and then back up again. So it was interesting to hear you say that you don't find stretching's helped at all. I imagine of someone of your height, or of our height, in fact I don't imagine, I know, that it can place a lot of stress on hips and lower back and knees. Do you just find that's a non-issue if you train sensibly and train within your parameters, and you've not found any benefit from foam rolling or stretching or anything like that?
Foam rolling, I'm a bit more hopeful, but really I'm not convinced that it does more than modulate the nervous system, just like stretching mainly does. People think it's morphological, right? They think it actually improves muscle length. It doesn't. It does not change your resting muscle length at all. Foam rolling most likely doesn't either. So what we know is that both of these things, foam rolling and stretching, we know two things with a great deal of certainty. It reduces pain. And via that mechanism, mostly, it makes the nervous system more relaxed about allowing muscles to lengthen. Beyond that, we actually don't have any convincing evidence that it really does much in terms of muscle knots or fascial release or any kind of stuff like that. So most of the effects people think and why it feels good is just a reduction in pain. And that can be an end of itself, but it does mean that a lot of people, it's overrated for what most people use it for. And in terms of squatting, for example, I find in my clients that squatting is almost always a stability issue, not flexibility. Because if you lie down on your back and you drop your knees, almost everyone can get into a perfect squat position. So when you are not facing the forces, you don't have to resist gravitational forces, and stability is not a factor. Simply getting your body into that position is not a problem. So it's not a morphological issue. Your body can be put in that position. It just doesn't work when you're also trying to apply force. So it's stability and not flexibility. That's the issue for most people. And for that, the best thing you can do is become stronger and squat, 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 squat. So the best thing you can do for your squat, and what I found worked for my squat, get better technique, squat more.
I thought you were going to say like Bosu balls and things like that, so I'm glad you didn't go down that route. But yeah, I think I've the only thing that I've noticed, and this could be, I don't have N=1 and I don't have any data to back this up, but I've noticed that it reduces the incidence of injury for me, the more kind of general mobility work that I do. But you know, similar to you, like I've never noticed if I spend hours stretching my hips or hamstrings that my squat depth improves. Like that's always been technique changes or bar placement changes, which is I have a similar kind of gripe with you that I've spent, if I could take back all the time that I've spent stretching and use it differently, then I'd either be, I don't know, richer or stronger or something, you know, depending on how I'd used it. So that is a frustrating thing. But I remember in the video you mentioned something about dropping something on your toe. Is that right?
Right.
Is that? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it was a seated calf raise machine in Ecuador, and it had loading room for I think 8 plates per side, and I was putting plates on, and I had about 400 pounds, with most of it on one side, but not nearly even all of it. The whole machine fell over and fell on my foot, and then it bounced and hit the other foot. And then I basically, or I almost blacked out and went to the hospital and walked on crutches, and it was during my contest prep, not the best timing in the world. But it worked out pretty well. I recovered really fast, ignored everything the doctor said, and got back in the gym as soon as possible, trying to stay as active as I could while avoiding pain, and check up and ditch the crutches as soon as possible. Took the what's the thick stuff called? It's like the almost cement-like stuff they put around your leg. I think I broke that off with a kitchen knife or something, because I wasn't allowed to. They literally wouldn't do it. So I removed it like after I think 1 week, 2 weeks, and went pretty well. But it's only now really that I can say that it's fully recovered, and especially the strength asymmetry took a long time to recover from.
Wow, that's pretty grim. We were at a competition on Sunday, and after Johnny competed, there was a guy dropped 235 kilos on his foot as well. I think it was the slimline plates as well. So very
bounced, moved, and then back onto his with like a 25 kilo Lico just straight down. But
wasn't happy.
The most I've ever dropped on my foot is a 20 kilo bumper, and I know how much that hurt. So 400 pounds.
And a calf machine.
In Ecuador. The main question that's running through my head is how big are your calves if you're handling 400 pounds on a calf machine, to be honest.
Yeah, but, not big at all. Like my calves, I have like Paper Mario calves, because when you look at them from the side, like it's like they're almost not there. They look okay from the front, and they're the same size as my neck, but from the side, it's like they're not there. So
this is all the bodybuilding illusion.
Yeah.
So interesting as well what you said about the foam rolling. We interviewed Dean Somerset a few months ago, and he was saying something similar, that people often, he said when he sees people foam rolling for like 45 minutes, the neuromodulation that they've got at the start of the foam rolling session has already faded away by the time they finish, and he said it's basically a complete waste of time. So
which is
really
heartbreaking.
It is
heartbreaking,
considering how painful it is as well. It's not exactly a fun activity. So we've got a couple more questions for you, Menno, if you've got time. The first one,
Sure.
and it kind of relates to, you said that you spent some time kind of crash dieting, and I know Greg Nuckols talks about, he's got an article called Grow Like a New Lifter, we'll link to that in the show notes, where he's talking about if you lose muscle over a short term, if you're losing the contractile proteins, that's not necessarily the worst case scenario, because of the satellite cell density. You can always regrow that domain quite quickly. So want to know what your thoughts on that are, and also in terms of metabolic damage as well, because I guess they're linked in the sense that if you lose muscle from dieting aggressively, what's the scope for recovering to that, and also is there going to be any kind of sustained damage to your metabolism or ability to gain muscle?
All right. Okay, so the first shout outs to Greg Nuckols. He's a good guy, friend and colleague in evidence-based fitness. I read most of his stuff, pretty much all of it really, and it's good. He's one of the good guys in the industry. Okay, so as for the actual content of his article, I'm not exactly sure what he wrote, but I remember reading that article, and it supports what is basically the modern version of muscle memory theory. It used to be the case that we thought it was just a neural process, because it made most sense, mainly because of the name. Memory, you think nervous system, temporal lobe in the brain. Muscles don't remember anything, so it has to be like a neural thing, but it's actually also a muscular thing, because like you say, you retain these myonuclei, these new sort of command centers in your muscles, and they're there to stay even if you lose the contractile mass around it, and they still help increase myogenic cell activity, which means that you can, as long as those command centers are still in place, it's like they allow you to rebuild the base really quickly. So you can grow like a new lifter again when you've lost a lot of muscle mass. But it's a compensatory mechanism. So, it's great if you did it unintentionally, or if 400 plates dropped on your foot and you couldn't do any training for 2 weeks or longer. But that it's not something that's actually useful. Like you're not going to sacrifice muscle for it, so take advantage of it, because as soon as you're back to your original muscle mass, you lose the effect. So the best case scenario is you need less time to recover the muscle mass. It doesn't provide any net benefit over time. So it's very nice that we have this, but it doesn't have any practical application if you're not unintentionally losing muscle mass. All right, moving on to metabolic damage then. The Bayesian research team had recently published a paper on that, a review paper, reviewing the actual data that is available in terms of metabolic damage for wrestlers, competitive bodybuilders, Minnesota starvation experiment, other kind of experiments where people lose a lot of weight and then they gain it back on, and they're carefully monitored in a lab, or like the biosphere experiment, metabolic ward research. And there we find that if you take body composition into account, and we use formulas that look at someone's metabolic rate as expected from their body composition and how that changed over time, then we find that your metabolism indeed decreases more than you'd expect when dieting, which is called adaptive thermogenesis. But it's an adaptation. It completely reverts when you gain all that muscle mass back. And fat mass also plays a role, but it's mainly muscle mass. So, after a contest prep and you've been through a whole diet, you were 5% body fat, you lost a little bit of lean muscle mass, you go back up, you're back at a new level for your energy expenditure.
So
you still there? I think I lost you first.
We missed that last bit. But what you're saying is that the metabolism has a capacity to recover from extreme dieting once the calories are back up to what they were.
Yeah, so it's mainly your body composition that determines your metabolic rate. As soon as you have recovered your lean body mass and you're at the same fat percentage again, then your metabolic rate will be the same. So it's adaptation, it's not damage.
That's pretty good to hear, and the fact that you've been through the data, looked at all of the different kind of quite extreme cases, in the case of Minnesota starvation experiment as well. Although I imagine some of that, once you've controlled for loss of muscle mass and things, probably does normalize a little bit. For anyone that's listening, the Minnesota starvation experiment was underfeeding some conscientious objectors to World War II for 6 months, was it? And
yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and just observing all the different changes, physiological parameters and psychological, and seeing how they responded. And they all developed clinical anorexia by the end of it, which is pretty interesting. Yeah,
like frightening. Mm.
Cool.
So, reasons to not die, I suppose.
Yeah.
So something else we wanted to ask you about, Menno, something that I have some experience with, kind of managing alongside a powerlifting career, is alcohol, and your thoughts on it. Whether you have, I think there's kind of differing opinions on it in the industry. Some people think that, or I suppose the initial thinking around it, like I remember my first exposure to any thinking behind alcohol was that it impairs protein synthesis, it's bad for testosterone production, and lifting and alcohol do not go together. Then I suppose, I think Martin Berkhan was probably the first person that I came across that countered that opinion, and had the model of protein only on the day of drinking, and protein intake, and then drink as much as you'd like, stick to spirits and white wine and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on it and any experience with it and kind of practical advice.
Yeah, that's very similar to my recommendations, what Martin Berkhan recommends. I wrote a detailed guide on how to get wasted without wasting your gains. But first, let's discuss alcohol's damage. It's really not nearly as bad as you'd think. Like, it's bad. There's no question about that. We know that it decreases muscle protein synthesis. We know it's literally toxic for your balls. So it decreases testosterone production. But both are really not that disastrous. If you look at even binge drinking, you have studies like people chugging out 8 consumptions of alcohol like right after their workout. Okay, done with squats, onto the beer.
Right.
And even then, you're looking at decreases of muscle protein synthesis. It's around 20% often. So not nearly as bad as you would expect. Things get really bad when you're talking about alcoholism, of course. because then you get chronic effects, and then testosterone levels do or can plummet really badly. But from like one binge drinking event, testosterone levels recover really quickly. Muscle protein synthesis isn't nearly as badly affected as you would think. So it's definitely something you can incorporate into your lifestyle if you mitigate the energy intake, which is where a lot of people tend to go most wrong. Because alcohol, not just another bad thing about alcohol is it doesn't just contain a lot of calories, like 7.1 calories per gram. It's a macronutrient, alcohol, ethanol. So one beer is like 150 calories, wine is usually 125, and spirits are like 100. So that's what you said. Like, it's good advice to stick to spirits in terms of energy intake. But because it results in what psychologists call disinhibition, basically impairing your judgment, having a lot of energy in itself, and then also being an appetite stimulant. When it comes to dinner place on the corner after having gone out. So if you can avoid that and you keep that in check, what I really recommend a lot of people do is have a prefixed meal ready so that you know when you get home or wherever you end up, you have that meal that you can eat, and you know that you're not going to be starving, right? So that's the thing with, if the alternative is starvation, then a lot of people are like, okay, well, screw it, I'm doing the cheat meal. But if you know that at least you won't be hungry and you'll have a nutritious food that might also decrease your hangover the next day, that really helps. So other than that, sticking to spirits, limiting energy intake. Another thing that I think is really undervalued is you want to be really, really honest with yourself, whether you're drinking to get wasted or you're drinking because of social pressure. And, you know, for a lot of people, it's at least in part the social pressure. But let's say that you're a really controlled individual and you drink literally just because of the psychoactive effect to get wasted. So then you actually do not want to eat anything beforehand. You want to be fasted. You want to chuck down the spirits on an empty stomach, like one after the other, because that overloads the liver the fastest way, which maximizes blood alcohol concentrations, which gets you the effect. And then with it's ironic because it seems like you're doing a lot of damage, but you need the least amount of alcohol in total to get the highest effect. So you actually want to be very systematic and efficient in intoxicating yourself.
Such a Germanic approach to.
But I didn't expect that last add-on,
But that is the thing is, like, that's as you said, if you're going to be fully honest with yourself, if you're looking to get wasted, I like that you've given some specific tactics to just maximize the liver load and get as drunk as possible with the least amount of alcohol. And we'll also link to your guide in the show notes as well for dealing with alcohol.
When I was, I probably shouldn't share this, but I'm going to. When I was at uni, this was when we just started writing articles, and I wanted to run an experiment to see if it would be possible to drink more than enough alcohol to get drunk to last you the entire evening, wake up the next morning and have the smallest hangover possible and be able to train and things like that. Because a lot of the advice we give centers around the idea that if you can maintain average calorie amount, training volume across the week, total sleep, then probably alcohol's not going to have a material impact. So we drank alcohol. We drank a shot of vodka basically every minute on the minute for like 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
CrossFit style.
Basically, yeah. Did a wad with alcohol. And 5 of us did it. The 2 girls didn't make it out of the house. The 3 guys did. One of them didn't make it home. And I was part of the elite 2 that made it back and felt fine the next morning. So it works. But
you just got to be careful.
You just have to be there's a 3 out of 5 chance that you'll come a cropper, I think is the technical term. So, but yeah, you're right. I think social pressure certainly in the UK is huge around alcohol, especially if you're involved in fitness or involved in some kind of fitness pursuit. You find yourself in a bar on a Friday night and you're like, oh, I'm not going to have a beer because of gains. Then straight away there tends to be an onslaught of criticism, and people end up drinking that way, I think. So it's good advice. Stay fasted, stick to spirits, get it done, get in, get drunk, get out as quick as you can. I like it.
Same with training, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, just as a final... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually good to know in terms of what's happening in those scenarios. Like, in terms of psychological research, what you're doing is when you're not drinking in such a scenario, or when you are choosing a healthy food option and other people around you, they're eating crap, or you're exercising and they're not during a holiday, what you're doing is basically providing a mirror to themselves. So they don't really care about what you're doing, right? Most people there, if they're your friends, they support that you're happy and doing things that are improving your life. People aren't that bad haters. But when you're doing it when they are there, it triggers cognitive dissonance, because they see this behavior and they implicitly often know that it's, the more rational course of action, but they also know that they are not following that course of action themselves. So this triggers cognitive dissonance again, which means what we just talked about. It's often easier to try to persuade you from not doing it and invoking social pressure, group norms, those kind of things, and trying to get this idea that you're the outcast, you're the weirdo, than actually trying to change their own behaviors, which in the case of fitness is really hard for a lot of people. So it's basically a social strategy that people employ to make them feel better about themselves, because you make them feel bad about themselves, because in comparison you appear so devoted and reasonable.
That's such an interesting point. And I suppose, so it triggers the guilt in people because they see it as a mirror for themselves.
I would definitely recommend not trying to explain that to people at the time, because it might not go down that well. Or in fact, it doesn't go down that well, trust me. But you're right. Like, it's easy to sort of bring someone down to your level than it is to try and rise to theirs, I suppose. But
I think we've all got bad memories of being made to come up and dance at a wedding or something by, the...
This is Yusuf's drunken diaries experience.
So, just on that note, Menno, speaking of kind of state change and psychoactives, you've written a little bit about a few of these. So I guess the most commonly used ones in the bodybuilding land would be pre-workouts, caffeine, things before sleep, phenibut, phosphatidylserine, if I pronounced that right, and up until recently, I don't know if it's legal in Thailand, but GHB was a bodybuilding supplement to increase growth hormone and sleep, but it's also sold as Rohypnol, which is a date rape drug, so it's not legal anymore.
I don't think it's sold as a date rape drug, but just to clarify, that's another use for it.
That's true. So I wanted to get some of your thoughts on using these kind of compounds for gains, and what your thoughts are on using these strategically.
All right, let's start with date rape.
Start with date rape.
I knew that was coming.
So for your gains, actually, GHB is like the superior version of alcohol. It's like it does a lot of things the alcohol does without the calories. So quite unfortunate that people have to go around raping people because of this. It messes up our gains. But
I think that needs to be the quote of the podcast.
That's going to be the name. Yeah. Stop raping people because you're messing up everyone's gains.
Right. But honestly, it would be something that is actually good for the social, like nightlife sphere in terms of people's health, and not just bodybuilders. But often, for these drugs, they get banned because people cannot be reasonable with them. And we're left with alcohol because it's just so ingrained now that the government cannot. They tried it, right, in the US. Didn't work out so well. So
does GHB not have quite a lethal side effect if you mix it with alcohol? Like, I'm sure in certain dosages it can lead to death if you're using GHB and then drink at the same time.
I think you'd need a ton of it, but there is an interaction. Alcohol interacts with a surprisingly large amount of other psychoactive drugs, basically always making it worse, generally amplifying the effect of the alcohol in particular. Also many painkillers. But it really depends on which other drug or supplement do you want to talk about.
Cool. So, I guess should we start with pre-workouts and stimulants and caffeine?
Right. So the story with caffeine is basically that it's great, but it's actually a really good example of people overusing it, because we know that caffeine is really addictive. Well, it depends on what your definition is, but your body rapidly develops a tolerance to it, to the point that when you're drinking 4 cups of coffee, then we know that you have a higher total average anxiety level than if you hadn't been drinking any caffeine, and you've pretty much lost all ergogenic performance enhancing effect from it. So it doesn't feel that way though, because what's happening is the alcohol is making you feel less bad. It's actually reducing withdrawal symptoms. So the caffeine, I think I said alcohol.
Yeah.
So, all right. So the caffeine is just making you feel less bad, because if you do not consume any caffeine for 24 hours or so, you're going in withdrawal, even if you're not the type that gets a headache and immediately notices it or that readily, then it's still occurring. So how you actually want to use caffeine, like most drugs, is to be really cognizant of its tolerance, addiction, and toxic thresholds, and stay under those. So for caffeine, for example, you want to stick to about 100 milligrams generally, as a male at least, per day on average. And then you can reap the ergogenic benefit every workout, even though that is actually really small, and it's mostly a psychological effect. Like, it makes you feel like it's doing a lot, but actually in terms of strength, research generally finds that you need, I think it's about 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight to actually increase performance, and then it's still like a minor effect. So it's mostly just makes you feel a lot better, makes you feel like the workout's easier, even though it's really not.
So that's an argument for everyone to stop drinking coffee.
I'd say that. Yeah, switch to decaf, I'd say.
Okay, and then 100 milligrams pre-workout as the dosage.
Yeah, then you can get the benefit consistently every day.
Okay.
As opposed to needing caffeine to bring yourself back up to normality again each time.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, personal example, I went cold turkey with caffeine. I got to the point where this was back in the office job, and I was having between 600 and 800 milligrams a day, which just mainly from caffeine pills. And it does get to the point where you think, actually, this isn't healthy. Went cold turkey, pushed through the the membrane of withdrawal, and 6 months later, you're so resensitized to it that even like a cup of tea, which would be, say, 20 milligrams, is tangible and noticeable. So yeah, I think it definitely makes sense to reduce the dosage and just resensitize yourself to it.
I always think it's easy for Yusuf because he doesn't like coffee.
Well, it's fine.
So
I'm just pretty indifferent.
So the only reason that I ever have caffeine is because I enjoy coffee, and so we kind of have this back and forth where, I could switch to decaf, but it doesn't taste the same. I'm sure everyone will disagree with me and say that it tastes exactly the same, but it doesn't taste the same. And so to completely cut out coffee is it's like something you like doing consistently, and you get like the caffeine buzz side effect as something different. I don't think I can understand the caffeine pills thing.
Yeah.
having a gram a day of pills, caffeine pills, but I guess everyone's different.
It's pretty bad, but a lot of like the commercial pre-workouts will have silly doses
they're very high. Some of them
stuff in,
and other things as well, I suppose.
That's true.
That have since been banned. So that's how you personally use caffeine. So small dosages frequently pre-workout, you still reap the benefits and avoid any of the kind of the tolerance build-up.
It seems like the recurring theme with you is that you're looking for the maximum effect for the minimum dose and just being quite strategic with everything that you do. What about things like phenibut? I know you've written about that as well, as like a pre-sleep or a nootropic as well.
I think it works really well, especially for social anxiety and people that are a bit more nervous, like in terms of big 5 personality traits. So especially women, it tends to really relax people, and it might actually have benefits in terms of recovery as well. It's a very, very significant growth hormone booster. Now, growth hormone doesn't really do what most people think it does. It doesn't make your muscles grow, but it might enhance sleep quality, recovery, in terms of connective tissue health. Might be slightly stimulating your energy expenditure, so it might boost fat loss a little bit. But it's not going to be like a big boost to your muscle gains. The thing is, with Phenibut, people vary enormously, mainly depending on how anxious they normally are in terms of personality, to how they respond to it. So me, for example, I am very, very not anxious. I just to illustrate like how bad it is, before I had job interviews, I would take caffeine pills.
Right.
So most people, they need to calm down, right? And I need to get hyped up for a job interview. Otherwise, I'd just sit there and be like, yeah. So I would need a very high dosage of Phenibut, and that's also what I notice in myself, which means I cannot use it very frequently. Because in the article, you can do the math and you can find the addiction threshold and stuff. But if you use like a few grams of it, or even just 2 grams, often that means you can only use it like once a week, because Phenibut withdrawal makes caffeine withdrawal look like nothing. So it's really bad. It can even induce psychosis.
Wow.
So this is something I was going to mention to you actually, because I bought my brother a couple of years ago some Z12, you know, it's like a Phenibut-based sleep supplement from T Nation, and so for Phenibut, for people listening, is a form of GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it's quite it does have this propensity for tolerance and withdrawal. And I told my brother, don't take it every day, whatever you do. Didn't listen to me, took it every day, called me up in a frenzy at the end of the month, being like, Yusuf, you need to get me some more of this Phenibut. Like, I can't sleep. I'm thinking like, well, I told you so. So I guess this is one of the risks, really. And I wanted to ask you really about things like phosphatidylserine, because any of these compounds that are designed to, to modulate cortisol, GABA, that kind of thing, do you think there's a chance it can dysregulate the adrenal axis or something, where there's some ideas that things like benzodiazepines used to calm people's anxiety will just upregulate the alpha receptors, let's say, so that when you then come off it, you're more sensitive to external stresses when you don't have the drug.
It may, if you have strong drugs. For example, you're talking about meth, then you're talking about meaningful changes to the dopamine system, for sure, which is part of the reason why withdrawal is, so bad from these kind of drugs. For most things that are legal, even though the relationship between legal and power is really, really slim, like we talked about, it's not that big of a concern. Generally, a few days should normalize things. So, caffeine does it too. But almost always you see that the changes are not permanent. There are some hints that it might be permanent in terms of like heroin, crystal meth, like speed. But it's really shaky evidence, because it's like largely cross-sectional. You see people with, for people that are lower in dopamine, they are more likely to be addicted. And then, the question is it the cause that they use these drugs and now they have low dopamine levels, or are these just the kind of individuals that get addicted more easily?
I see. So on the flip side then, I guess, is there any way that you can use these kind of things, so things like caffeine particularly, to entrain new patterns? Or so if using nootropics, I guess in the same way that you would with foam rolling, where you're making some kind of change, you've increased the plasticity of a muscle or of your brain, you can then access that new range of motion or that new that new function to then establish a new pattern and a new habit.
Possibly, but I'd be skeptical of that for most things. Like where a similar kind of thing happens, you're talking about things like magic mushrooms, psilocybin. They may actually, at least anecdotally, for a lot of people, sort of open their mind, or they come to some sort of conclusion in the trip that has profound, lasting effects on what seems to be their personality and overall demeanor. which is in contrast to what you usually see. Like if you use caffeine or alcohol, it has acute effects and you feel very differently on it, but afterwards you're right back to your original self.
Right, so this is about kind of strategically using them for an acute benefit. I think the number I heard for psilocybin was 1 year later, people who had a single dose were one standard deviation higher on trait openness, which is pretty fascinating. And that's well beyond the time frame of any kind of pharmacological effect.
Yeah, exactly. That's and it's huge, a standard deviation.
Massively.
For a change. Yeah, because personality doesn't change much as a function of age, as a function of really anything once you're past 21 years old.
Yeah, pretty big stuff.
So, eat more eggs, eat less protein. If you're going to drink alcohol, then do so on an empty stomach and take loads of drugs. Those are my takeaways. No, I'm joking. Okay. Menno, it's been fantastic.
You forgot, don't rape people.
Don't rape people.
Take magic.
That's the key one.
Most important.
Take magic mushrooms. Chuck down lots of alcohol really fast.
And stop the raping. Stop the raping. Menno, it's been great having you on. We really appreciate you coming on to speak to us, and some fantastic insights and great takeaway points that I'm sure everyone will be able to implement straight away, hopefully. Where can we find out, or where can our listeners find out more about you other than your website? Do you have any other social media outlets, podcasts, things like that?
Right, yeah. You should find everything on my website. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook mostly, but recently launched to pretty much every social media channel there is to see if there's a market there. And you'll find everything from my website. You can subscribe if you're interested. Check it out.
Fantastic. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Okay, Menno, thanks for coming on. That's everything from this episode of the Propane Fitness Podcast. And we'll speak to you soon.
My pleasure, guys.